Alberta Premier Danielle Smith addressed Albertans on Tuesday night. She spoke about a whole number of affordability measures meant to tackle inflation. Now, to talk about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, joining us from Edmonton. Now, Tyler, one of the announcements is that the remaining 4.5 cents of provincial fuel tax will be taken off once again.
And it sounds like it may be gone forever at some point.
Wow.
There was sort of this hint in her speech that it was going to be sort of an indefinite removal of the fuel tax. So, people see about 4.5 cents off the cost of gas in the next little bit here, and then certainly continuing. And that's for at least the next 6 months. And then they're looking at some way to sort of make it more permanent. So yeah, that's one of the measures, and I think probably the one that people are going to notice the most immediately.
Premier Smith also announced $600 per child checks to families and $600 per senior, and that'll roll out, over the next 6 months as well?
That's right. Yeah, the timelines are not super specific at this point. Whether that $100 a month or $200 every 3 months, every $300 every math is not my strong suit, Hal. But at any rate, there is going to be $600 per child and $600 per senior. It is somewhat means tested. It's capped at family income of about, I think, $180,000. So those family incomes higher than that won't receive those checks. And of course, those without children will not receive checks either, unless, of course, they're a senior. So this is not quite a return to the Ralph Bucks or even what Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe did over there with $500 checks. But certainly something that a lot of parents are going to be happy about in the next few months, because, of course, we're going into Christmas, and Christmas and New Year is usually a pretty sort of tight financial time for families.
Yeah, I remember those Ralph Bucks, the dividend checks. Was it $300 or $400 per every man, woman, and child? Those are the good old days with the royalties
The good
rolling
old
in.
days.
But Tyler, what about financial help for those of us who have adult kids and are not yet seniors?
I'm sorry to say you're out of luck, Hal, and I am too. Don't have kids and also not a senior, so we are. Well, maybe we should be used to it by now. People with kids and seniors get all the goodies. But the real, to be serious about it for a minute, I think part of what is going on here is that those are the cohorts of people that tend to vote. Seniors vote in really, really high numbers. Peoples with families are very, very invested in the political process. So I think that's a thing worth considering. When single folks aren't getting tons of government money here and there, maybe it's because we're not voting. So just a little aside, a personal bugbear of mine over the years.
Now, naturally, the opposition NDP was unimpressed with Premier Smith's address. Rachel Notley said Smith was undoing problems the UCP had originally created.
Well, and I mean, she's not wrong about that to some extent. The other part of what happened on Tuesday night was she announced that they were going to be re-indexing a bunch of social programs and income tax. So if you were on assured income for the severely handicapped, the AISH program, you got X amount of money, and it went up with inflation every year. So in the 2019 budget, the government stop doing that. So the amount of money you received in 2019 or 2020 has remained the same, of course, as the cost of everything else has gone up. And the same has happened with income tax. So that was a UCP policy decision made, in a very different budgetary environment to the one we're in right now. And Danielle Smith is undoing that. So I mean, in that sense, Rachel Notley is, I think, more or less correct. And the other thing that she's really been hammering on her social media in her remarks and things like that is that the NDP is trying to promise stable, competent government. And I think that's going to be a theme. There's been a few sort of small scandals with Danielle Smith, some ups and downs, a little bit of a bumpy road, let's say, in the opening weeks. And I think that's very much the tone that Rachel Notley is going to try and set over the next few months. And we saw a little bit of that on Tuesday night in her response to Danielle Smith's remarks.
Yeah, Tyler, it should be a huge battle. I mean, the Alberta provincial election is coming up next May, and healthcare is back in the spotlight once again, as it should be. Now, some of it stems from a position paper Premier Smith wrote for the University of Calgary's School of Public Policy. Can you explain?
Sure. So I won't go too into detail on it because it's all really complicated, but sort of the Coles Notes version of it is that this paper sort of imagined a new way of healthcare delivery. And one of the things that has come up and been discussed is that the health spending account, which is going to be, I think, $375 per Albertan to spend on any sort of healthcare they want, the proposal seems to be that at some point, a health spending account of some size might be the way that we would pay for healthcare. It wouldn't be out of pocket necessarily. It would be government money. We just sort of have an account to spend from. So it's this sort of reimagining of healthcare that was in this position paper. Whether or not that's going to translate directly into government policy is a little bit harder to say. We simply don't know at this point. But it has given the NDP the chance to do what, of course, they love to do politically, which is talk about American-style healthcare, raise the specter of people paying for healthcare out of pocket, running out of money, and not being able to afford health services, things like that. So that debate has broken out into the open, maybe a little bit earlier than we would have expected, because of this position paper, and it's forced Danielle Smith to say, no, look, I support universal healthcare, and sort of make that commitment. So bit of, you could quibble over whether or not the NDP's attacks are fair on this, but that discussion's back, and we're 6 months out.
My family was shocked recently when one of my family members went to see a nurse practitioner here in Lethbridge just for a referral to a doctor and to a specialist. And one of my family members was charged $150 for just that referral from the nurse practitioner. And I'm like, wait a minute. So I reached out to Steve Buick, Copping's, press secretary there. He says, that's not right. They shouldn't have done that. But then I looked up on AHS's website and it says, well, if the nurse practitioner is not practicing in a doctor's office or hospital, they're allowed to do that. So that was quite interesting. Now, still with healthcare, the entire AHS board was fired last week, Tyler, and replaced with a single administrator, a gentleman by the name of Dr. John Cowell. Cowell was, I believe, in a similar role years ago with the Redford administration. What will Dr. Cowell's biggest challenges be?
Well, yeah, so Dr. Cowell came out of retirement for this. He joked in his press conference that he'd finally got his golf score down to his age, and had to give that up to come back to work. So he is really facing a number of problems. The emergency room wait times are one of them. Ambulance response times, the number of ambulances on the road, are others. And so he's basically got 6 months to make a pretty big dent in some of these issues. Now, some of the policies changes that are, and so he's going to be studying this. He wasn't coming in and saying, look, X, Y, Z is going to happen. Here's how we're going to fix it. He's sort of going to look at the situation, look at the metrics, what the situation is now, and what it could be down the road. Some of the things that they're sort of planning on changing could, I think, be done relatively quickly. A good example of that was the possibility that 911 dispatch operators could refer people to HealthLink, to the health line that people call to discuss health issues, instead of having an ambulance dispatched. If an ambulance isn't necessarily needed, they might dispatch a different style of vehicle to transport someone, things like that. But on things like surgical wait times and emergency room overcrowding, these are big problems that governments have been trying to tackle for decades, I would say. So that's really the big challenge that he's going to face, is how is he going to come at these really substantial problems that people have been demanding fixes on for a long time, and no one has quite figured it out. So I think every Albertan is probably wishing him all the best on figuring out those problems, because there's no easy answers in there, I don't think.
And I believe he'll answer directly to Health Minister Jason Copping and then Premier Danielle Smith as well. Tyler,
Yes,
we always
right.
talk about the UCP and the NDP. It seems like really a two-party system here in Alberta, similar down to the United States, south of the border, with the Republicans and the Democrats. But the Alberta Party here in our province is starting to make a little bit of headway with their leader, Barry Morishita, who had kind of a decent showing at the recent by-election of Brooks Medicine Hat, which was won by Danielle Smith.
He did, yeah. Danielle Smith, I think, had around 6,000 votes, and the New Democrat candidate, Gwendolyn Dirk, had 2,500 or 3,000, and I think Barry Morishita came in about 1,000 votes below that. So a reasonably good showing for a third party, I think. He is planning on running in Brooks Medicine Hat again, which is where he lives, former mayor of Brooks, I believe. So, but he was saying just the other day that they're planning on running candidates in all 87 ridings, and they're holding a convention in the next couple weeks in Edmonton. So there is sort of this third party option, this middle of the road option, if people are not super enthused on either side of the spectrum. Of course, I think both the New Democrats and the United Conservatives are going to be looking at this wondering just how strong the Alberta Party is going to be and whether or not that's going to split the vote a little bit. It's a less obvious vote split maybe than an obviously right-wing party or an obviously left-wing party, but you might see some votes bleed from either side over to the Alberta Party. So we'll have to see. I think people are interested in Barry Morishita, and I think people know of him, especially in Brooks Medicine Hat. And I can't think of, the former leader, I think, was Stephen Mandel, which is a very different political career than Barry Morishita's had.
I believe Mandel was the mayor of Edmonton at one point in time, right? And I remember having Mandel on our show, and I asked him, I said, well, how would you sum up the Alberta Party? He says, we're socially liberal, but we're fiscally conservative. I thought that was quite interesting. Tyler, the legislature returns next week. We should be seeing the usual pomp and ceremony of his speech from the throne and the return of question period. But what's also on the docket is the Alberta Sovereignty Act.
That should be the first thing that happens, I think. It's going to be really interesting. Now, in her remarks Tuesday and in a speech recently, I think to the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, Danielle Smith sort of gave us the full name of the Alberta Sovereignty, and it's a bit of a mouthful. It's Alberta Sovereignty within a United Canada Act. So, say that 10 times fast. So that is what it's going to be called. The details of it are still, a little bit shrouded in mystery. There's been a lot of speculation, I think, on whether or not it's going to sort of hew to the original sort of vision that was laid out in the Free Alberta strategy, whether or not there's going to be some moderation of some of the more out there elements, I guess one could say. So we'll have to see what it's going to look like. But the thing I did want to mention was was a really interesting development in the last few days where all of the treaty chiefs in Alberta got together, maybe the first time ever they've all gotten together and agreed on something, and basically said they don't like the Sovereignty Act. They don't agree with it. They say that they made their agreements with the Crown, not with the government of Alberta, and that the Alberta government cannot do anything that's going to sort of unilaterally change that. So it's a really interesting show of unity among all the chiefs in Alberta. And the Premier's office said, look, consultations are coming with Indigenous Albertans, and we are going to not affect their, treaty rights and treaty agreement with the federal government. But it's just an interesting dynamic, and I think we're very much going to hear about that in the days ahead.
Tyler, Todd Loewen, Danielle Smith's Parks Minister, has been tasked with attempting to wrestle cash away from Parks Canada and keep it here in the province. Tell me more about that.
This is an interesting one. I think it's a sign of some of the little side battles we might see between this government and Ottawa. The premise is basically that parks fees paid at the gate, $21 or whatever it is to go in for the day, those fees should stay in Alberta. And as it currently works, those fees go into the Parks Canada pot, and they're sort of redistributed around the country to the various national parks. Alberta has 4 of them, of course, and they cover, I think, about 25% of park operating costs. And the parks, of course, are run and operated by Parks Canada, the federal government, not the Alberta government. So, do I think this is going to be a winning battle for the Alberta government? It doesn't strike me, frankly, as super likely. But it is interesting to see that they are opening up some of these new frontiers, I think, in feuding with the federal government.
There was some recent controversy involving Premier Danielle Smith over her ancestry. Tyler, APTN originally broke the story that investigated Smith's claims of having Cherokee heritage. What did they find out?
Well, so they basically went through American records, and there's quite good records for the Cherokee in particular in the United States because of the relocation, I think, to Oklahoma or from Oklahoma. My history on it, my grasp of the history is not super great, but basically they couldn't find any evidence that Danielle Smith had Cherokee heritage. They tracked back ancestors by the same names and stuff like that, and couldn't find a record of it. So an interesting story there. And so I got comment from Premier Smith's office, and what they said was, look, these were stories told around the kitchen table, and she has not done a thorough deep dive into her family history, but she remains proud of her roots. I suspect this is not a thing that's going to go away for her just yet, but it is just because I don't think she's been asked about it at a press conference or in public, but it is just another issue that she's going to have to deal with in the weeks ahead.
Very interesting, absolutely. He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post. Tyler Dawson, thanks for joining me today from Edmonton.
Always a pleasure, Hal.